August 14, 1847. The screaming started just after dawn. By the time the neighbors arrived, Colonel Harrison Whitmore was already convulsing on the porch of his estate. His fingers clawed into the wood, his mouth foaming with something that wasn't saliva. His wife stood frozen in the doorway. His children watched from the windows. And the doctor, when he finally came, could do nothing but record the time of death. Cholera, they said. Summer sickness. Bad water. But this was the 12th time in 3 years. 12 plantation owners. 12 wells. 12 deaths that all looked like nature's cruelty. No one suspected the slave who stood 30 feet away, holding an empty bucket. The one who never spoke. The one whose name no one bothered to remember. The one whose eyes, if you'd cared to look, held something far more dangerous than rage. Calculation. This is not a story of violence. This is a story of intelligence weaponized through invisibility, of a mind so precise, so patient, that it turned servitude into a stage for perfect revenge. And it almost worked. No one remembers when he first arrived at the Whitmore estate. The records only say this: one male Negro, mute, age uncertain, purchased April 1843 from the estate sale of Richard Pemberton, deceased. 4 years before Colonel Whitmore died on that porch. 4 years of drawing water, feeding livestock, cleaning stables, moving through the property like a shadow that no one thought to fear. In the antebellum South, a slave who couldn't speak was considered simple, damaged, harmless. The Whitmores called him boy, though he was well past 30. They never asked why he was mute, whether he was born that way or made that way. It didn't matter. Silence, to them, meant absence of thought. They were wrong. On the morning of August 13, 1847, one day before the colonel's death, the household ran as it always did. Breakfast at 6. Church preparation by 8. The colonel reading newspapers in his study while his wife organized the week's menu. Routine. Order. The kind of mundane elegance that wealth mistakes for safety. And in the background, the mute slave performed his duties. He drew water from the stone well at the edge of the property. 6 buckets. Same as every morning. He carried them to the kitchen, the washroom, the colonel's study. His hands steady. His face blank. No one watched him. Why would they? By noon the next day, the colonel was dead. Dr. Edmund Cartwright arrived within the hour, summoned by a rider sent in panic. He found Whitmore's body laid out in the parlor, already stiff, his skin mottled with a grayish pallor. The widow sat in the corner, her hands folded, her voice hollow. He complained of nausea this morning, she said. Then dizziness. Then he couldn't stand. Dr. Cartwright examined the body. No wounds. No signs of struggle. The symptoms matched cholera, vomiting, convulsions, respiratory distress. But something felt wrong. The progression was too fast. Cholera took days. This took hours. He opened his leather journal and made a note in careful script. August 14, 1847. H. Whitmore. Age 52. Acute gastrointestinal distress. Rapid onset. Suspect contaminated water or spoiled food. Cause of death. Undetermined illness. Burial recommended within 24 hours due to August heat. He signed it, closed the book, and rode home. He did not notice the slave standing near the kitchen door, watching him leave. He did not notice the way the man's eyes followed the journal. He did not notice the faint trace of crushed leaves near the well, already blown away by the wind. The funeral was held 2 days later. The estate was sold within the month. The slaves were divided among creditors. And the mute man was transferred to another plantation, 12 miles south, where, 6 months later, another master would die in his sleep. Dr. Edmund Cartwright was not a suspicious man. He was a physician in Albemarle County, Virginia, a region of rolling hills, tobacco fields, and old money. His practice served the wealthy and the dying, often both at once. He had seen fever, consumption, childbed death, and the slow rot of age. He had learned to accept mortality as routine. But by the spring of 1847, something was bothering him. It started 3 years earlier. June 1844. Thomas Braxton, a plantation owner in the northern part of the county, collapsed while overseeing the tobacco harvest. Violent illness. Dead within 8 hours. Dr. Cartwright was called too late to intervene. He wrote it off as heat stroke complicated by digestive distress. September 1844. Richard Pemberton, the same man who had once owned the mute slave, died in his bed after 2 days of severe cramping and delirium. Dr. Cartwright attended the death. He noted symptoms consistent with acute poisoning, but there was no evidence of foul play. Pemberton's slaves were questioned. Nothing. March 1845. Another plantation owner, 30 miles west. Same symptoms. Same rapid decline. By late 1846, the count had reached 8. Dr. Cartwright began keeping a separate journal. Not his official medical log, but a private record, written in tight, anxious handwriting, kept in a locked drawer in his study. On the first page, he wrote, "I am not a man given to paranoia, but I cannot ignore what I am seeing." He listed the names, the dates, the locations, and then, in red ink, he began noting commonalities. All men, all plantation owners, all in rural areas, all deaths occurring in warm months, June through September, when wells ran low and water sat stagnant. But there was something else. He cross-referenced the estates. 3 of the deceased had purchased slaves from the same auction house in Richmond. 5 had attended the same church. 2 had served together in the state legislature. And 4 had employed the same field laborers at different points in time. He underlined that last entry twice. In March 1847, Dr. Cartwright did something unusual. He visited the Whitmore estate, not as a physician, but as an investigator. He examined the well. He tested the water using the only tools available to him: lime water to detect carbonic acid, silver nitrate to check for chlorides. Both tests came back normal. But he noticed something strange. The well's stone edge was worn smooth in one spot, more than the others, as if someone had leaned there, repeatedly, in the same position. He made a note. Well shows signs of frequent use by a single individual. Stones disturbed near base. Recommend further observation. But he didn't know what he was looking for. Not yet. 2 months later, a 9th plantation owner died. Then a 10th. Then an 11th. And Dr. Cartwright began to realize something that terrified him more than disease ever had. This wasn't nature. This was someone. His name was never recorded. Not in the bills of sale. Not in the estate ledgers. Not in the court documents that would later seal his fate. He existed in the margins of history, a blank space where a human being should have been. But he was not empty. The year was 1842. He was 28 years old, though no one had ever asked. He had been born on a cotton plantation in South Carolina, the son of a woman whose name he barely remembered. He had not always been mute. At age 7, he made the mistake of learning to read, taught in secret by a plantation owner's daughter who thought it a harmless game. When the overseer discovered him with a book, the punishment was swift. They didn't kill him. That would have been a waste of property. They burned his throat with lye. He survived. But his voice did not. For the next 21 years, he learned a different language. The language of observation. He learned that white men spoke freely in front of slaves, assuming silence meant deafness. He learned that cruelty had patterns, predictable rhythms, favorite targets, repeatable mistakes. He learned that intelligence, when hidden, became a weapon sharper than any blade. And he learned about plants. On every plantation he was sold to, and there were 5 before Pemberton's, he watched the old women. The ones who brewed teas for colic. The ones who made poultices for infections. The ones who whispered the names of roots that could kill as easily as they could cure. Water hemlock, white snakeroot, pokeweed, jimsonweed. He never asked questions. He didn't need to. He simply watched, remembered, waited. When Richard Pemberton purchased him in 1842, he was assigned to well duty. Every morning before dawn, he would walk to the stone well at the edge of the property and draw water for the household. 6 buckets. Sometimes 8, if guests were expected. It was monotonous work. Beneath notice. Perfect. Pemberton was not the worst master he had served. But he was cruel in the particular way that educated men often are. Casual in his violence, certain of his superiority, utterly blind to the humanity of those he owned. One evening in August 1843, Pemberton struck a young slave girl for breaking a plate. 14 years old. He used a riding crop. 3 lashes across her back while the household watched in silence. The mute slave stood 30 feet away, holding a basket of vegetables. His face showed nothing. But something inside him, something that had been buried beneath years of forced obedience, shifted. Not rage. Rage was too loud, too reckless. This was colder. This was math. He began walking the property at night. Not escaping. That would have been suicide. But mapping. Learning. Identifying. He found water hemlock growing near the creek, its thick, tuberous roots unmistakable. He found white snakeroot in the shaded hollows, its leaves jagged and venomous. He found pokeweed near the barn, its berries dark and deceptively beautiful. He learned their dosages by watching animals. A sick cow that ate snakeroot and died within hours. A dog that chewed pokeweed roots and convulsed for 2 days before recovering. He learned that timing mattered. That dilution mattered. That patience mattered most of all. On September 12, 1844, Richard Pemberton died in his bed after 2 days of agony. Dr. Cartwright ruled it acute poisoning of unknown origin. The slaves were questioned, tortured, some of them. But no one confessed. Because no one knew. Except the man who drew the water. The man who had crushed snakeroot into powder 3 days earlier and let it dissolve, grain by grain, into the well's depth. The man who had stood silent while they buried Pemberton, his face as blank as stone. He was sold 2 weeks later at Pemberton's estate auction. Purchased by a man named Colonel Harrison Whitmore, who would die 3 years later, never knowing the man who killed him had been standing in his house the entire time. The American South, in the decades before the Civil War, was a place of brutal contradictions. Enslaved people were considered property, subhuman, incapable of complex thought. And yet, they were entrusted with the most intimate aspects of white survival. They cooked the food. They nursed the children. They tended the sick. They prepared medicines from plants that white doctors barely understood. The masters called it instinct, primitive knowledge. They never called it what it was, science. In the fields and forests of Virginia, there grew a pharmacopoeia of death. Water hemlock, Cicuta maculata, one of the most violently toxic plants in North America. Its roots, when crushed, released cicutoxin, a compound that attacked the central nervous system. Symptoms appeared within 15 minutes. Nausea, vomiting, convulsions, respiratory failure. Death followed shortly after. White snakeroot, Ageratina altissima, a plant so dangerous that it killed not through direct consumption, but through the milk of cows that grazed on it. It caused what frontier settlers called milk sickness, weakness, tremors, vomiting, death. Even Abraham Lincoln's mother died from it. Pokeweed, Phytolacca americana. Its berries and roots contained phytolactotoxin and phytolaxygenin. In small doses, medicinal. In larger doses, catastrophic gastrointestinal distress, convulsions, and cardiac arrest. And jimsonweed, Datura stramonium, known to every plantation as devil's snare. Its seeds and leaves contained atropine and scopolamine, alkaloids that caused hallucinations, delirium, seizures, and coma. The mute slave knew all of this. Not because he had read it in medical texts. He couldn't access those even if he'd wanted to. He knew it because enslaved people had been documenting this knowledge for generations, passing it down in whispers, in warnings, in the careful choreography of survival. Healers knew which roots would stop bleeding, which leaves would reduce fever, which bark would ease pain. And they knew the reverse. Which plants would mimic cholera, which would look like heat stroke, which would kill slowly enough that no one would suspect poison. This was not primitive magic. This was chemistry. But knowledge alone was not enough. Dosage had to be precise. Timing had to be perfect. And most importantly, the method had to be invisible. He couldn't lace food. Too obvious. Too many variables. Different people ate different amounts at different times. But water. Water was communal. Predictable. Essential. Every morning, the master's household drew from the same well. The same source. And in the heat of summer, when the water level dropped and sat stagnant, even a small amount of dissolved toxin would concentrate. All he needed was access, which he already had. He began his work in the late hours, when the household slept. He would approach the well with a small cloth pouch, no larger than a fist. Inside, crushed roots, powdered leaves, carefully measured quantities. He would lower the bucket slowly, silently, and release the powder into the water below. Not enough to cloud it. Not enough to taste. Just enough to kill. By the time the first symptoms appeared, the toxin would be untraceable. The well would be refilled by rain. The powder dissolved. The evidence erased by nature itself. And he would be standing there, blank-faced and silent, drawing the morning water as he always had. Invisible. 12 wells. 12 deaths. 3 years. This was not impulse. This was architecture. The first rule: never repeat the same poison twice in succession. Water hemlock for Pemberton in 1844. White snakeroot for Braxton 2 months later. Pokeweed for the third master in early 1845. Jimsonweed for the fourth. Each toxin produced slightly different symptoms. Each death looked like a different illness. Cholera. Heat stroke. Heart failure. Contaminated food. No pattern for a doctor to detect. No consistency for an investigator to trace. Only coincidence. And in the rural South, where death was common and medicine was primitive, coincidence was enough. The second rule: spacing. He never killed 2 masters in rapid succession. Months would pass between deaths, sometimes half a year. Long enough for grief to fade, for suspicion to dissolve, for memory to blur. In the gaps, he lived as he always had. Silent. Obedient. Unremarkable. He drew water. He fed animals. He repaired fences. He attended Sunday services, standing in the back with the other slaves, his head bowed in false prayer. And he waited. Patience was his greatest weapon. The third rule: selection. Not every master died. He didn't poison indiscriminately. That would have been reckless. That would have drawn attention. Instead, he chose carefully. The ones who were cruel. The ones who beat their slaves without provocation. The ones who separated families, who sold children, who used the whip not as discipline but as entertainment. He watched them. Studied them. Learned their routines. And when he was certain, when he knew that their death would go unquestioned, that their household would attribute it to God's will or bad luck, he acted. Colonel Whitmore had been a certainty. In the 3 years the mute slave served him, he witnessed Whitmore beat a teenage boy unconscious for spilling grain. He watched him sell a woman's infant to a trader from Georgia, ignoring her screams. He stood silent as Whitmore burned a man's hand in a forge for the crime of speaking back. Whitmore believed himself untouchable. He was wrong. On the night of August 12, 1847, the mute slave approached the well for the last time. The moon was a thin crescent. The air was thick with the hum of cicadas. The house behind him was dark, its occupants asleep. He carried a pouch of water hemlock root, ground into fine powder, mixed with a trace of jimsonweed for accelerated effect. He had prepared it 2 days earlier, drying it in the sun, crushing it between stones until it was fine as flour. He lowered the bucket slowly. The rope creaked. The pulley groaned. He poured the powder into the water and watched it disappear into the black depth below. Then he raised the bucket, hung it on its hook, and walked back to the slave quarters without looking back. The next morning, he drew 6 buckets as he always did. 1 for the kitchen, 1 for the washroom, 1 for the study. Colonel Whitmore drank his morning water at 7. By 8, he was vomiting. By 9, he was convulsing. By noon, he was dead. The mute slave stood near the kitchen door while the widow screamed. He watched Dr. Cartwright arrive, examine the body, and scribble in his journal. He saw the other slaves whisper in fear, wondering if they would be blamed. And he felt nothing. Not triumph. Not regret. Just the quiet certainty that justice, however small, however silent, had been served. But 12 deaths do not go unnoticed forever. And Dr. Cartwright was beginning to see what no one else had. A pattern drawn not in blood, but in water. Dr. Edmund Cartwright had not slept well in months. He sat in his study on the evening of August 20th, 1847, 6 days after Colonel Whitmore's death, surrounded by papers that no one else would understand. Maps, ledgers, death certificates, lists of names written and rewritten until the ink bled through the page. His wife had stopped asking what he was working on. She had seen the look in his eyes. On the desk before him lay his private journal, open to a page filled with red annotations. 12 names. 12 dates. 12 locations marked on a hand-drawn map of Albemarle County. He had spent weeks tracing the connections, visiting estates, interviewing widows and overseers, requesting access to property records that most men would never think to examine. And slowly, painfully, a picture had emerged. All 12 men had died between June and September, the killing season, when wells ran shallow and water sat warm. All 12 had owned large estates with deep stone wells, built decades earlier, their water sources isolated from creeks and rivers. All 12 had employed field laborers, slaves who rotated between properties during harvest seasons, hired out by owners looking to maximize profit. And all 12 had died of symptoms that mimicked natural illness but progressed far too rapidly to be natural. Dr. Cartwright leaned back in his chair and pressed his palms against his eyes. He was a man of science. He believed in evidence, in observable fact. But what he was seeing defied the assumptions of everyone around him. To believe his theory, he would have to believe that a slave, or multiple slaves, possessed the intelligence, the knowledge, and the patience to commit mass murder across 3 years without leaving a single witness. He would have to believe that the same people his society considered subhuman were capable of medical sophistication that rivaled his own. And he would have to say it out loud, to people who would think him insane. On August 23rd, he made a decision. He rode to the Whitmore estate one final time. The property was already being prepared for auction. The slaves had been gathered in the yard, waiting to be assessed and sold. Dr. Cartwright walked among them slowly, watching their faces. Most looked down. Some looked afraid. But one, standing near the back, holding a rope, looked at nothing at all. A man in his 30s. Unremarkable build. Calloused hands. And a face so carefully blank it seemed carved from stone. Dr. Cartwright had seen him before. At Pemberton's estate. At Braxton's funeral. Always in the background. Always near the wells. He approached the overseer, a man named Dalton, and asked a single question. That one. The mute. How long has he been here? Dalton glanced over. 4 years, maybe. Bought him from Pemberton's estate sale. Does well work. Keeps quiet. Why? Dr. Cartwright didn't answer. He returned to his horse, his heart pounding, and rode directly to the county magistrate's office. He brought his journal. his maps, his lists. And when the magistrate asked what evidence he had, Dr. Cartwright said the only thing he could say: test the wells. 3 days later, they did. And in the water of the Whitmore estate well, they found traces of something that should not have been there. Something organic. Something bitter. Something that had killed 12 men without making a sound. August 27, 1847. The county magistrate ordered the exhumation of Colonel Whitmore's body. It had been buried for less than 2 weeks, long enough for decay to begin, but not long enough to erase evidence. The coffin was raised from the family plot at dawn, before the heat could worsen the smell. Dr. Cartwright was there. So were 2 constables, a magistrate's clerk, and a chemist from the University of Virginia, a man named Dr. William Thornton, summoned specifically for his knowledge of toxicology. They opened the coffin in a cleared barn, windows open, rags soaked in vinegar tied across their faces. Dr. Thornton worked quickly. He collected samples of tissue from the stomach lining. He drained residual fluid from the abdominal cavity into glass vials. He examined the discoloration of the organs, pale gray, mottled with dark spots. "This is not cholera," he said quietly. Dr. Cartwright watched from across the table. "What is it?" Thornton didn't answer immediately. He sealed the vials and carried them to a makeshift laboratory set up in the corner, a table with a spirit lamp, glass beakers, and a collection of chemical reagents. For the next 2 hours, he performed tests that few physicians in Virginia would have known how to conduct. He treated the tissue samples with sulfuric acid and heat, watching for color changes that would indicate the presence of alkaloids. He tested the fluid with potassium iodide, searching for precipitates that would reveal plant-based toxins. He used a process called the Marsh test, primitive by later standards, but revolutionary for 1847, to detect traces of heavy metals or organic poisons that had passed through the digestive system. And slowly, methodically, he confirmed what Dr. Cartwright had suspected. "There are plant alkaloids present," Dr. Thornton said finally. "Multiple compounds. Cyclotoxin, consistent with water hemlock. Traces of tropane alkaloids, likely jimsonweed." He set down his tools and looked at Cartwright. This man was poisoned. Deliberately. And based on the concentration, it was introduced gradually over at least 2 days. Possibly through water. The magistrate, who had been standing silently near the door, stepped forward. "Can you prove this in court?" Dr. Thornton hesitated. "I can testify to the presence of toxins. I can explain the symptoms. But I cannot tell you who administered them." "Then we test the well," the magistrate said. They rode to the Whitmore estate that afternoon. The property was deserted except for 2 slaves left behind to maintain the grounds. The well stood in the center of the yard, its stone edge worn smooth, its wooden bucket hanging motionless in the heat. Dr. Thornton lowered a collection jar on a rope. He drew water from different depths, surface, mid-level, and bottom. He sealed each sample and labeled them carefully. Back in his laboratory, he repeated the tests. The results were undeniable. Surface water, trace alkaloids, likely diluted by recent rain. Mid-level, moderate concentration of cyclotoxin. Bottom water, concentrated toxins consistent with multiple plant sources. Hemlock, pokeweed, jimsonweed. Someone had been poisoning this well. Systematically. Over time. On September 1, 1847, the magistrate issued an order. All slaves who had worked on the Whitmore estate in the past 4 years were to be questioned. Special attention was to be given to those with access to the well. And one name appeared at the top of the list. A mute field slave. No recorded name. Age approximately 30. Purchased from the Pemberton estate in 1843. Last seen 5 days earlier, still on the property, awaiting sale. They arrested him the following morning. He did not resist. He did not speak. He simply lowered his head and allowed them to bind his wrists. They brought him to the county jail in Charlottesville on September 3, 1847. A small stone building with 4 cells and a single barred window. He was placed in the farthest cell, alone, his wrists still bound. For 3 days, no one spoke to him. They simply watched. The magistrate had ordered a systematic investigation. Every slave who had worked on the Whitmore estate was interrogated. Some were threatened. Others were beaten. A few were promised freedom if they confessed or named an accomplice. None did. Because none of them knew. The mute slave had worked alone. Spoken to no one. Trusted no one. His silence had not just been a disguise, it had been a fortress. But then, on the 4th day, an overseer named Dalton came forward with something unusual. "I saw him," Dalton said, standing in the magistrate's office, his hat in his hands. 3 weeks ago. Late at night. Saw him doing what? Near the well. I was checking the livestock, maybe 2 in the morning. And I saw him standing there. Just standing. Holding the bucket, but not drawing water. Just staring down into it. The magistrate leaned forward. "Did he see you?" "I don't think so. I was in the barn. I didn't think much of it at the time. Figured he couldn't sleep or something. But now." Dalton trailed off. The magistrate made a note. "Anything else?" "Yeah. One more thing. The morning the colonel died, I saw the mute bring water to the house. Same as always. But when he came back, his hands were shaking. It wasn't much. But it was enough." On September 8th, they brought the mute slave out of his cell for formal questioning. He was seated in a wooden chair in the center of the magistrate's office. Dr. Cartwright was there. So was Dr. Thornton. 2 constables stood by the door. The magistrate sat across from him and spoke slowly, as if addressing a child. "Do you understand why you're here?" The slave's face remained blank. "We have evidence that the well on the Whitmore estate was poisoned. We have testimony placing you near that well at unusual hours. We have chemical proof that toxic plants were introduced into the water supply." Silence. "If you confess now, we may show leniency. If you name others who helped you, you may avoid the harshest punishment." The slave did not move. Did not blink. The magistrate's voice hardened. "You will hang either way. The only question is whether you die alone or with others." Still nothing. Dr. Cartwright, who had been watching from the corner, stepped forward. "May I?" The magistrate nodded. Cartwright knelt in front of the slave, meeting his eyes. "I know you can't speak," he said quietly. "But I also know you can hear me. And I think you understand more than anyone in this room wants to believe." The slave's gaze flickered, just slightly. Cartwright continued. "I've seen the wells. I've tested the water. I've examined the bodies. And I know what you did. Not because you were caught in the act, but because it was brilliant. Too brilliant for most people to accept." He paused. "You used their assumptions against them. Their belief that you were simple, harmless, incapable of thought. And you killed 12 men without anyone suspecting you until it was too late." The slave's expression didn't change. But something in his eyes, something dark and cold and utterly human, acknowledged the truth. Cartwright stood slowly. "He won't confess," he said to the magistrate. "Not because he's afraid, but because he doesn't need to. He's already won." On September 10th, the magistrate ordered a trial. There would be no jury. Slaves were not entitled to one. There would be no defense attorney. Slaves could not testify on their own behalf. There would only be evidence, testimony, and a verdict already written before the trial began. The execution was scheduled for October 15th, 1 month away. And in his cell, the mute slave sat in silence, waiting for the end he had always known would come. September 24th, 1847. The trial lasted 4 hours. It was held in the Albemarle County Courthouse, a modest building with white columns and wooden pews that smelled of old paper and tobacco smoke. The room was filled beyond capacity. Plantation owners. Overseers. Curious townsfolk who had heard rumors of a slave intelligent enough to commit mass murder. They came to see a monster. What they saw was a man sitting motionless in a wooden chair, his wrists shackled, his face betraying nothing. The magistrate presided. There was no judge. Virginia law did not require one for slave trials. There was no defense. The accused could not speak, and even if he could, his testimony would not be admissible. This was not a trial in any meaningful sense. It was a formality before an execution. Dr. Thornton testified first. He explained the chemical analysis in careful, methodical detail. The presence of cyclotoxin in the tissue samples. The alkaloids in the well water. The consistency of symptoms across multiple deaths. This was not accidental contamination, he said. This was deliberate poisoning, executed with knowledge of plant toxicology and an understanding of dosage that suggests significant experience. The magistrate asked, could a slave possess such knowledge? Dr. Thornton hesitated. The room went silent. Yes, he said finally. Enslaved people have served as healers and herbalists on plantations for generations. They possess botanical knowledge that often exceeds that of white physicians. It is not impossible. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Uncomfortable murmurs. Dr. Cartwright testified next. He presented his maps. His lists. The connections between the 12 deaths over 3 years. Each victim employed slaves who rotated between properties, he explained. The accused was present at 4 of the 12 estates at the time of death. He had direct access to the wells in each case. And in every instance, the deaths followed the same pattern, acute poisoning disguised as natural illness. But you have no witnesses, the magistrate said. No one saw him administer poison. No, Cartwright admitted. But the evidence speaks for itself. 12 men do not die of identical poisoning by coincidence. Then Dalton, the overseer, testified. He described seeing the mute slave near the well late at night. The way his hands had trembled the morning of Whitmore's death. He was always around those wells, Dalton said. Always drawing water. Always alone. I never thought nothing of it. But looking back, he was too careful. Too deliberate. Like he was doing something he didn't want anyone to see. Finally, the magistrate called for evidence of motive. A plantation owner named Gerard Finch took the stand. He had owned the slave briefly in 1845, before selling him at auction. Was he disobedient? The magistrate asked. No, Finch said. That's what made him valuable. He never spoke back. Never resisted. Never caused trouble. He was obedient. Too obedient, maybe. Did you ever witness cruelty toward him? Finch shifted uncomfortably. Discipline, yes. Same as any slave. Nothing unusual. Define discipline. Finch didn't answer immediately. Then, whipping. Confinement. Standard measures. And how did he respond? He didn't. Just stood there. Blank face. Like he didn't feel it. The magistrate made a note. Or like he was remembering it. At no point during the trial was the accused asked to respond. He sat in his chair, his eyes forward, his expression unreadable. When witnesses described his intelligence, he showed no pride. When they described the deaths, he showed no remorse. When they speculated about his motive, he showed no reaction at all. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the magistrate delivered his verdict. Based on the evidence presented, the chemical analysis, the circumstantial testimony, and the pattern of deaths, I find the accused guilty of 12 counts of murder by poisoning. The sentence is death by hanging, to be carried out on October 15, 1847. The gavel struck. The crowd murmured. And the mute slave was led back to his cell without ever having spoken a word in his own defense. But the story did not end there. Because 3 weeks later, something impossible happened. October 15, 1847. Dawn broke cold and gray over Charlottesville. By 8 o'clock, a crowd had gathered in the public square, hundreds of people, drawn by curiosity and the grim spectacle of justice. The gallows had been erected 2 days earlier, a simple wooden structure with a trapdoor and a noose that swayed gently in the morning wind. The mute slave was brought from the jail in a wagon, his wrists bound, his ankles shackled. 2 constables walked beside him. A minister followed, reading scripture aloud. The slave's face remained blank. They led him up the steps to the platform. The magistrate read the charges one final time: 12 counts of murder, death by poisoning, crimes against God and the Commonwealth of Virginia. The minister leaned close and asked if he wished to confess his sins before God. The slave said nothing. The minister asked if he wished to pray. The slave did not bow his head. At 8:30, they placed the noose around his neck. The crowd fell silent. The executioner positioned his hand on the lever. And in that moment, the last moment of his life, the mute slave did something he had not done in over 20 years. He smiled. Not broadly. Not triumphantly. Just a faint, almost invisible curve at the corner of his mouth. Then the trapdoor opened, and he fell. His body was buried in an unmarked grave outside the town limits, in a field reserved for executed criminals and the unclaimed dead. No stone. No marker. No name. History swallowed him whole. But 36 days later, something strange began to happen. On November 20th, a plantation owner in neighboring Fluvanna County died suddenly after a week of violent illness. Symptoms: nausea, convulsions, respiratory failure. On December 8th, another death. Same county. Same symptoms. By January 1848, 3 more plantation owners in the region had died under nearly identical circumstances. Dr. Cartwright, now deeply unsettled, traveled to each site. He tested the wells. All contaminated. All poisoned with the same botanical compounds. The authorities were baffled. The mute slave was dead. He had been executed. Buried. Gone. So who was killing now? Theories spread like wildfire. Some believed he had taught others before his death, that there was a network of slaves enacting coordinated revenge. Others believed it was coincidence, that the attention given to the trial had inspired copycats. And a few, mostly whispered in the slave quarters, never spoken aloud to white ears, believed something darker. That he had never worked alone. That his silence had been a signal, not a limitation. That 12 wells were only the beginning. By the spring of 1848, the poisonings stopped as suddenly as they had begun. No arrests were made. No confessions given. The records fell silent. But in the decades that followed, a legend grew in the oral histories of formerly enslaved people. A story about a man who could not speak, but whose actions spoke louder than any words ever could. A man who turned his chains into weapons and his servitude into a stage for perfect revenge. A man whose name was never recorded, but whose intelligence, patience, and fury became a ghost story told in whispers. A warning to those who believed silence meant submission. There is no grave marker. No monument. No plaque. No historical site where tourists can stand and reflect on what happened in Albemarle County between 1844 and 1847. The man who poisoned 12 wells does not exist in official history. His name was never written down. His voice was never heard. His story was buried with him in an unmarked grave, and for over a century, it remained there. But in recent years, historians and toxicologists have begun to revisit the case. In 2003, a researcher at the University of Virginia discovered Dr. Cartwright's private journal in a collection of archived medical documents. The red ink annotations. The lists of names. The maps. In 2011, a forensic chemist analyzed historical accounts of the symptoms and confirmed that they were consistent with plant-based alkaloid poisoning, specifically water hemlock, jimsonweed, and white snakeroot. In 2018, a documentary team attempted to locate the execution records. They found the trial transcript, the magistrate's notes, The testimony. But they found no name. Just the words, one male Negro, mute, age uncertain. What remains is not a person, but a question. How many others were there? How many enslaved people, denied education, denied voice, denied humanity, possessed intelligence that their masters could not see because they refused to look?